Hey Simon, great to hear from you and have you back on board. Um, I wanted to chime in here. I watched Conrad's video and he's obviously taking care of the programming side of things. Got your Facebook message, and obviously we've talked about your hamstring and your wrist off and on over the past period of time. So I wanted to put some thoughts into video format and see if we can't do some things to help get the hammy and the wrist feeling better as soon as possible, and kind of get them out of the way and then keep them under wraps as we get into the bulk of this block. So sort of the hammy first. Like I said or on Facebook Messenger, tendons can be a bit tricky. And I can speak from firsthand experience with tendons, hamstring tendons, no less. Tendons heal well. They're well vascularized. They bounce back pretty quick. The tricky bit is that they tend to take a little longer than, say, if you had a strain in a muscle belly or you had a cut in your skin. Those would bounce back faster than a tendon would. Tendons, however, will bounce back generally a lot quicker than, say, ligaments or bone or things like that. So that's good news in the grand scheme of things, in that they do heal well. The tricky bit is that on the way to healing up and feeling back at 100% is managing the factors that stress them out. So one thing we might have to do is, or not might have to, one thing that we should do, or a question I'll pose to you is, what are the main aggravating factors of the hamstring? Does it flare up primarily during a movement, squats, deadlifts? Is it stuff outside of the gym that flares it up as you're walking up and down stairs, as you're walking on uneven surfaces, or bending forward to pick something up? Do you find that it flares up at certain times of the day, or is it really aggravated by activity particularly? On the flip side of that, are there any things that really make it seem better? Typically with tendons, doing some slow eccentric work. And I'm not talking about really heavily loaded things, but slow eccentric work prior to your training. Let's say if deadlifts were aggravating factors, doing some slow eccentric hip hinges with enough weight to make you feel like you're being pulled forward, but we're not talking about approaching working set loads for your deadlifts. Taking a 20-kilo kettlebell or something like that. Maybe that's a bit much. Like a 15-kilo kettlebell, and doing some hip hinges that way. To the point where you feel a stretch, staying shy of pain, and hanging out for a second or two at the end range. So you do the slow eccentric, then you pause at the bottom for a second or two, and you come back to the top, you do some more of that. Usually helps with making tendons hurt less. It's a neuromodulatory mechanism, so it seems anyway, in the research, which is great, because if it allows us to train the way we want to without pain, that's perfect. Another thing we'll have to keep an eye on is volume and or intensity thresholds. This is, again, if symptoms come on with particular movements. One thing we'll watch for is that if you do a certain amount of volume, or if it seems like you do a certain amount of volume and the symptoms flare up, then okay, that's a volume threshold. If you surpass a certain weight and if you surpass a certain weight and the symptoms flare up, that might be an intensity threshold. And our goal is to fly underneath those, try to do as much training as we need to, but fly underneath those limits. And then the idea is that as we fly under those limits and we don't keep bashing our heads into them, those limits will move. Your volume threshold will increase, so will your intensity threshold. That's if they exist in the first place. And I imagine that they do, because you're mentioning the hamstring still hurts, and I'm going to assume that it is training related. You get to tell me if I'm right or wrong about that, and we'll take it from there. But for now, first working recommendation is that if it is in fact training related, and if squats and or deadlifts are a little grumpy sometimes, try those slow eccentric hinges with a kettlebell or something like that. A barbell works too in terms of sets and reps. Try 2 or 3 sets of maybe 5 to 6 repetitions, and take your time, maybe 3 seconds on the way down, a pause for a second or two, and then up you go. Now moving on to the wrist, sharp shooting pain from the sounds of it. in the wrist and in the hand, I think you said in your last message, seems to be intermittent. You hadn't had pain for 2 to 3 weeks, and then we had some occurrence of extreme pain, as you say in the spreadsheet today, but you were able to manage it and get through the squat sets. Another question, well, similar sort of question as before with relation to the hamstring, but what sort of things do you feel bring it on? Obviously, you had pain during squats. Do you find that the wrist pain comes on during bench press as well? Or is it mostly a squatting kind of thing? Would also love to know if deadlifts aggravate it. So one thing that we might have to look at is how you're setting up for your squats. If you find that squats are an aggravating factor or main aggravating factor, wrist position is something that we should look at. I just watched an Instagram video, and you don't squat with anything, with what looks to be anything really cocked back for your wrist. Although, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if that was your high bar or low bar. If that was a high bar and your wrist was more neutral, it would make sense that with your low bar, you'd have to extend a little bit more to get in the same position. So, first recommendation is play with grip width a little bit. It'll probably feel weird in terms of you're used to a certain level of tension having your arms close. And I remember that your arms, you tend to be pretty close to your torso with regards to your arms. That's worked well for you. So if we're moving it, it'll feel a bit weird. Try to get as tight as you can. But I want to know if, say if you start off with your usual grip width, you start to move that arm out, you'll be able to extend your wrist a little less and play with positioning. Try to find the closest you can be without getting pain. Maybe it's the case where the wrist pain is intermittent depending on the day, in which case that's fine. On days you don't have pain, then do your normal stuff. On days you do have pain, play with position. Try to be a little systematic and see if we can find a place for you to be without causing more of that pain to come on. Let me know how that goes, obviously. I'm also interested in if anything makes that wrist feel better. So with both of these issues, though, as much of an annoyance as they are, and as troublesome as they are, I don't think that these are things that are going to be sticking around for a long time. They're here and now sort of problems. They're not going to be Simon in 4 weeks sort of problems, I don't think. So you're a systematic guy, and I really appreciate your updates because you give us lots of information to use, and then we're able to use that information to make the best decisions possible. So let's keep that rolling. Let me know what you find this week. Shoot me messages as you need to, and I'll get back to you ASAP. And have a really strong year. Cheers, man.